Okay, let me go ahead. So anyways, Malatesta, a decade after Kropotkin's passing, he says, I remember the small attentions which I would call maternal, which Kropotkin bestowed on me. When one night in London, having been the victim of an accident, I went and knocked on his door. So my question here is, what does it mean that Kropotkin, one of the forefathers of anarchism, one of the patriarchs of anarchism, is here attributed with maternal attention, okay? And, what is the connection or the possible connection between maternal feminist thought and anarcho-communism, mutual aid? So before I get to the question of maternal, I want to talk about what's an attention, okay? So an attention is not yet the exertion of a free volition of a sovereign will, okay? An attention is an activity and a receptivity. It's an activity motivated by the passivity of one's awareness. And the reason why I talk about this is that, there are other things in us besides our will. We are already affected by each other. We're already responsive to each other. We're already responsible to each other. We're already reacting to each other before we start acting out of ourselves. So that's the first point. Now, to say that we're born of mothers seems like really obvious, yeah? But oddly, if you look at the history of political philosophy and philosophy, since the Greeks, there's this very weird denial of the fact of birth. And we find in Thomas Hobbes, who's one of the, inaugurators of modern political thought, this statement or this imagination, let us return again to the state of nature and consider men as if but even now sprung out of the earth and suddenly, like mushrooms, come to full maturity without all engagement to each other. So there's two obvious things about this which strike me as pretty weird. First of all, we have this individual just kind of coming out of nowhere, completely autonomous, completely free, its own will expressing itself, unrelated to anything. And if it is related to anything, it's related to death, okay? A mushroom is born out of the decay of death, not out of, a life-giving mother, okay? And we find, throughout Hobbes' thought, and it's not just Hobbes, it's Nietzsche, it's Heidegger, it's plenty of people, this idea that life is animated by death. Hobbes has this theory of mechanism, and it's, just these impersonal forces just like knocking against each other and producing these effects that look like life, that produce consciousness, that produce action. But the forces themselves are impersonal, they're inhuman, okay? And human beings in this thought become the expression of these materialistic or material wills to power. And if they're motivated by anything, they're motivated by their fear of death, at least in Hobbes. So this will, this self-assertion that drives towards power, that drives towards glory, it eventually in Hobbes' scheme finds itself in a competition with other wills. And this struggle, culminates in the war of all against all. Motivated by its fear of death, the political subject, creates a voluntary contract with other subjects to submit to the will of the state. Now, let's look at feminist theories for a while. And this is, of course, a very certain subsection of feminism, which is a broad field unto itself. And we find this idea of birth, that it's a connection with other people through, in material terms and in temporal terms, okay? And it's distinct. Birth is distinct from this metabolic process that creates life out of death, out of the rotting of death, okay? And we have Tricia Glay's book, she's saying, pregnancy is a rounding logic of the self into the other. Contrary to Aristotle, who says, two bodies can't be in the same place at the same time. Glazebrook is like, no, pregnancy, that's two bodies, same place, same time. There's a sharing of space, a sharing, a connection by two separate beings. And here I go to Levinas, and he has this idea of maternity as anarchy. And let's first talk about arche. So arche is this ancient Greek term, and it connotes both like the first principle and also the ruler of can you turn off the echo, please? And Levinas thinks of anarchy as this, it's so disruptive that it disturbs any attempt to posit one's own self as the first principle. So neither is there, the self is not grounded in itself, and it's not grounded in this nothingness, or this death that Hobbes fantasizes about. And there are two ways, one is temporal, so there's this past behind us, and it's not my past. I can't consider it my own. And there's this material aspect to it that I'm bound to other bodies before I'm linked to my own bodies. There are other examples of this. When we eat, we incorporate substance, and this substance comes from other people, from their products that they produce, that as, remnants of their substance. When we breathe, we take in the substance of air, which is once your air and will be their air, and so on and so forth. The material of our lives is already indebted to other lives before we're even born. This, I really want to focus on anarchy, not as free will, but as a debt and a dependence. When we properly understand our own bodily and our own existence in time, we'll see that we're birthed from other bodies. The material of our own lives is already indebted to the material of other lives before we're even born. So now the idea of dependence, and here I want to talk about dependence. Let's think about dependence itself. I feel like we have an easy time talking about interdependence. I scratch my back, you scratch mine. But let's think about dependence itself. Before we establish ourselves as autonomous selves, we already require that other people have provided us with allowances and accommodations. Before we assert ourselves as wills, we're already bound to other people by ethical obligations, by just the necessities of being. And the task that Kittay lays out, and I think it's an anarchist task as well, is to recognize the central importance of human dependency and to provide a society that takes care of the dependent, that takes care of the person who performs dependency work. So Sarah Ruddick, maternal thinker, and the important thing here is maternal as she uses it. It's not an instinctive thing that moms have, and it's not a gendered role. It's a practice, and it's a practice that preserves the life of the child, nourishes their growth, and prepares them for acceptance in the wider society. And it's received as a demand, okay? She says to be committed to meeting children's demand for preservation does not require enthusiasm or even love. It just means to see the vulnerability and to respond to it, okay? So this idea that things can impinge upon us from the outside, like the awareness that I talked about at the beginning. And we have to be careful here to distinguish obligation and domination. So this sort of obligation, it's not a domination, it's another sort of thing. It's an ethical obligation. But it certainly can become a form of domination. And when we look about, in practice, that, people who are caretakers, people who are mothers are the most exploited. It's a form of work and it's exploited throughout. It's women of color, immigrant women, even like mothers are exploited in their labor. So let's finally turn to Kropotkin, okay? So I want to say that mutual aid is a maternal factor of evolution, okay? By attributing mutual aid to the evolutionary instinct of a species, it's both a temporal, a claim of time, and a claim of physical material being. about how our material lives are dependent upon and responsible for the care of others. And I want to focus on the idea of aid. So it's not just mutualism. It's not just I do something, then you do something in return. It's that we require the aid. We're dependent on other people. Previous to this, natural selection was interpreted as the survival of the fittest, which is basically just a scientific rationalization of Hobbes, this war of all against all. Kropotkin, calls mutual aid and mutual support, quote, a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of the species, and its further evolution. So here we hear the echoes of this idea of the maternal practice as providing a material basis for the sustenance of biological life for needs and desires. We also have this idea of this anarchic debt to the past. Kropotkin says, if we have access to intellectual satisfactions and live in not too bad material conditions, it is because we have benefited through the accident of birth by the exploitation to which the workers are subjected, and therefore the struggle for the emancipation of the worker is a duty, a debt which we must repay. So, and this idea of debt, this anarchy of debt, this before our times, we already owe other people our material being. It makes the idea of private property absurd because our own lives, our material being is already built on the efforts of other people who have, labored, suffered, and died to produce them. And we incur this debt before we emerge as individual selves, before we emerge as individual wills. And for this reason, Kropotkin concludes, it's absurd to claim that, any facet of this is my own private property. And this belief that we exist as atomized selves with wills unto our own really distorts the idea in which we are radically dependent upon other people. And I want to contrast this again with, this idea of voluntarism, and egoist association and self-assertion. So we find in Stirner, this idea of association, and quote, if I can use him, I surely come to an agreement and reach an agreement with him to strengthen my power through this agreement and to accomplish more through combined force than individual force could achieve. In this mutuality, I see nothing beyond a multiplication of my strength, and so it is an association. So this idea that we join each other to, for the purposes of self-assertion, for the purposes of asserting our wills. And in Kropotkin, it's very different. Associations form in response to human needs, okay? They're always, or almost always presented as responses to human needs rather than vehicles for self-assertion, forming libraries, forming societies, forming, enumerating the houses, feeding people, The interdependence that people establish through such associations, it does so by embracing the dependencies that constitute who we are and by fostering our responsibilities towards others. And this sort of vision of these obligations will challenge us, obligations to meet dependency, challenge us to envision and organize a society, an anarcho-communist society that will respond ethically to human needs and accommodate human dependencies, investing us with the freedom and the will, the voluntary will, to establish forms of social organization that will meet these demands. And I just want to conclude this with some notes from Leah Lakshmi Pepsina Samara Sinha. Sorry if I mispronounced that. And she's a disabled queer activist out of Canada. And, she makes the point that, the only way that we or they as queer disabled people survive is because they take care of each other. No one else is going to come and take care of them, or at least historically that has not been the case. And, within this sort of mutual aid, people who are femmes get exploited because they're always giving. And, her recommendations in this article is, that we acknowledge this sort of labor as work and we recompense those who perform it. People who take care, should really be at the center of our thinking of anarchism, I'm going to say. And we need to treat them fairly, and this will also encourage, the cultivation of a broader culture of mutual care. So anyways, that's about it. I just want to challenge us to think of Kropotkin and to think of anarcho-communism again, not in terms of voluntarism, but in terms of dependency. And the challenge of anarchism is to think about how do we take care, how do we nurture dependency and need, rather than, or in addition to, how do we assert ourselves? So thank you for your time, and thank you for all the presenters and organizers.
Thank you, Mitchell. Now I think we're ready for Vadim Damia and the translation of Pascal.
Добрый день, дорогие коллеги. Тема моего доклада Петр Кропоткин,